Ben, hello. Good morning.
Morning, Bradley. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Good. Thank you. And before we get into it, Ben, just want to say that if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A area. And also, Ben and I are really keen to hear your experiences within your company, how you've developed culture. You know, some examples. Ben will always aim to dispel some myths around culture. So, you know, Ben is keen to hear from attendees what they've done, whether it's a company of 2 or 3 or a company of 30 or 40. Everything in between and bigger. So yeah, Ben and I'll pick up the questions. Ben is happy to answer them. So we'll get straight into it, Ben. And you are known as the culture guy. You work with lots of companies across the country doing that. So what do you mean by culture? It is a bit of a, I'll play devil's advocate slightly and say it's a bit of a fluffy term. It may be a little bit touchy-feely to some people thinking, why do I need to implement culture? What is culture to you? How would you define it?
That is always the first question that everybody asks me, and they always have those kind of reservations. Is it not just a little bit touchy-feely? But culture is simply the kind of the shared values and beliefs of a group of people and the associated behaviours that come with it. And I'll give you a really, really simple example. If I came round to your house and you answered the door and I just pushed past and went and sat on your sofa and started watching your TV and eating your snacks, would that make you a little bit uncomfortable in your house? Why does it make you uncomfortable? What is it? And there are rules and there are kind of shared understanding of that's just not the way you behave. That's not appropriate. And that's all that culture is, that little word appropriate. You know, when groups of people come together, either, you know, 2 kids in a playground or 30, 40, 100 people in a company, eventually there will be some shared norms, some shared values, some shared beliefs and behaviors that go with that. And that is all that culture is. And yes, when you start to look at it and you start to implement some culture change, some of the things you do may be a little bit touchy-feely, but what you're actually trying to do is shift people's behaviors. And that's all that culture is, those kind of shared values that lead to behaviors.
Sure. And you know, why is that important? From a business perspective, you know, there's a lot of talk at the moment with so many people remote working and working from home, and I think the general perception of building a culture is everyone under one roof and everyone in the same office environment. I mean, both pre-COVID and now, what are the impacts of having a good culture amongst your team from a business perspective? Because ultimately, as a business leader, as an owner, director, numbers are important. So why is building a culture so important, and how is that linked to business performance?
Well, you know, every organization will have a culture, whether you've explicitly defined it or you've just let it kind of grow organically. Every organization will have a culture, and it will affect everything in your organization, from your dress code to whether you let people work at home or not, even during a pandemic, to how you hire people, to how you answer the phone, to your marketing messaging. It affects everything. And so the question is, if it's going to affect everything, why are you leaving it to chance? Why are you leaving it to organically develop? And if you do leave it to organically develop, it's usually the loudest and the most forceful people that have the biggest impact on it. And it has an impact in everything. The research essentially shows that if you build a strong culture, your revenue can increase by up to 700%. And that's research that's gone back 20 years and looked at companies. So the bottom line is, if it's going to affect your revenue to that level, and it affects lots of other things, but you know, the revenue is the one that everybody looks at as the kind of yardstick. If it's going to affect that to increase it by 700%, why are you not spending time looking at it? And I think it's probably good at this point to distinguish between what we mean by good versus bad culture or strong versus weak culture. Now, the research is all on strong versus weak culture, not good or bad. There's no judgment call in kind of value base of what is good culture and what is bad culture. I'll give you a quick example. Uber, back in the day when it started, had a really, really strong culture of competition and win at all costs. And that culture is what took them to the billion-dollar valuation, to where they are now. It's not a place I would want to work. And when we look back, there were some lines that were crossed that people look at and go, that's not a nice culture. But it was a strong culture, and it's the strength of the culture, the really clear, this is who we are, that drives those results, not necessarily good or bad.
Mm. And from a business perspective and as an owner's perspective, how do you start to implement culture? If that's something that, you're just starting out, or you may be years into your business, how do you go about assessing that, aside from sort of calling someone like yourself? But what would they need to do to look at to identify, right, I think this is a culture issue or something that we can work on? So where would a business start from that perspective?
If you're looking at culture change, if you're looking at saying, actually, the way we're doing things now doesn't feel right, it's not working, we can't figure it out, actually, our culture is wrong, how do we go about changing it? We take companies through a 4-stage process. And the first stage is about definition, defining why your organization exists and the values that you are going to hold in doing business. So the lines you will not cross. What is important to you? And to give you a couple of examples, one of our values is about being a cheerleader, not a critic. One of our values is, says, look, people can do amazing things, more than you possibly thought they could, if you are encouraging and support them and cheerlead them. If you're a critic, they don't do so well. So actually, one of our values is constantly looking for ways to cheerlead people and constantly trying to stop ourselves being a critic, because we all do it, and it's a natural thing for us to do. And so actually, that's one of our values, and we're really clear on that. And so when anything we then do gets measured against it. So that first part is about defining those values. What are the rules of the game that you are going to play here? And then the other 3 parts of the framework are all about implementing it. Gathering a team that understands and shares those values. Creating your communication that reinforces those values. Building your processes and procedures and the way of working that reinforce and reflect the true values and don't cut across those values. But the start of it is you've got to be really clear on what you stand for. Why does your business exist? And what are the rules of the game as far as you're concerned in terms of how you are going to play it?
It's a great point, and it's starting to build that analogy where you say culture sits in the middle, and whether that's recruiting people, whether that's your communications and your marketing, and just the way that you prospect and you sell, the culture is something that your clients buy into, the people, and how you promote your business ultimately. So I can definitely see that. You talk about the growth barrier, Ben. Explain what you mean by that, because that's something you've written about at length in books and things like that. So what is the growth barrier, and how do you know when you've hit it? And firstly, explain what it is before you get to that point.
Yeah, the growth barrier is it's a place where all entrepreneurs and business founders eventually get to. When you start a business, you've got your hands in everything and you're running everything and you are the drive, and the values stem and the culture stems from the fact that you are actively involved in everything. So you can control that culture. But there comes a point when you get to kind of 20 staff, you get to £1 million turnover, that if you want to grow any further, you've got to let go of some stuff. You can't work any harder. So you have to let other people start carrying some of that load. And unfortunately, if you haven't built your cultural structure, often what happens is when you start to let other people carry the load, when you take your hands off, it doesn't quite go as well. Everything gets a little sloppy. Things don't work as you intend them. Your values aren't reflected in the way things are done. And so you put your hands back on and you try and control it again. And you get to that point where it becomes impossible to grow because you have to be involved in everything. And there is only so much as an entrepreneur you can do. And so you know when you've got there, because you can't take a holiday without having to come back to chaos. You spend most of your time firefighting problems and solving everybody else's issues rather than actually focusing on growing your business. And lots of things like that. And there are other things, you can add people to the business, but you don't seem to be able to get proportionate revenue from adding people to the business because they don't have the structure to do what you're asking them to do. And so at that point, breaking through that growth barrier is about building that cultural structure so that when you step away, the quality of the work continues. People understand the value base, the kind of playing field you've put them in, and they can operate within that playing field. They understand that you care about your customers, and therefore when they phone you up with an issue, you solve it on the phone, because that is one of the values you have in your organization. And when they understand the values, you're able to start taking your hands off. And I'll give you a quick example. I worked with an organization in London, and they came to me with exactly that problem. They had to spend time in the office. Anytime they went away to try and grow the business in another country, they came back to chaos, and they couldn't be away from the office for more than 24 hours without feeling like things were starting to slide. So I came in and I said, well, what I want you to do is I want you to implement unlimited holidays, and I want you to implement more flexible working. And they're like, that is just totally counterintuitive. We need more control, not less. And I said, look, try it for a month, see what happens. If it's not working, we'll stop it. So they tried it for a month, and they came at the end of the first month, and they said, look, it actually seems to be doing something, but we're not quite sure what. We'll try it for another month. So eventually they tried it for another couple of months, and they came back to them, and we sat down and said, right, what are the results of this? And they're like, we don't understand it, but we've had the best 3 months in the history of the 6-year history of our organization. Revenue has just improved massively. Productivity has gone up 40%. Staff turnover has dropped to 0, despite at least one person handing in their notice every month prior to that. We've had nobody in the last 3 months. And the real kicker, which even I wasn't expecting, was that the amount of holiday taken in those first 3 months was exactly the same as the amount of holiday taken in the previous year. It's like, so it's cost you nothing, and productivity's gone up 40%. And it's about, they created a culture where all of a sudden they said to their people, you're an adult. When you're at your desk, it's your choice, so do your job. And they did. And it's little things like that that actually just have such a big impact on breaking that growth barrier. They got stuck in that place where they couldn't grow anymore until they were able to let go. And a couple of small changes that cost the company nothing enabled that process, really.
Yeah, well, it's I'm sure there's some other nuggets that you can share with people before we finish. We've got a couple of questions, but before I get to that, some people may think culture is the example that the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, and chuck a few beanbags in the office and sleep pods and things like that. But it's so much more, isn't there? But we'll come to a couple of questions, James. Luke Bryce from Blue Line Security has asked, how do you breed culture in a company where staff work A, alone, B, mostly at night, C, across the country, and don't see us or colleagues often? As a security company, Luke's staff are spread up and down the country. So what would you answer that then?
Yeah, and that's a really good one, especially now that we've got more and more people working away from the office remotely. There's a couple of things in there. One is actually making sure everybody understands the why. You know, Simon Sinek talks about it. Start with why. What is it you are delivering? You know, why is the world a better place? Because your company is in it. Making sure everybody in your organization actually gets excited by turning up to work and wanting to do the job well, and really being clear on your values. You know, what are the values that we're living here in a security company? Is it about actually we look after our the environments we're protecting, and we want to make sure that we are proactive in doing that? So is everybody proactive? Are they all doing their jobs over and above? Are they all going the extra mile to protect those spaces? I'm putting words in your mouth, Luke, obviously, but that may be one of your values. Is everybody clear about it? So what I would suggest in that situation is regularly bring them together for those team meetings, either a Zoom call or whatever, to say, look, who's done really well on delivering those values this week? Let's give you a praise. Let's reward that when people have stepped up and done those values, so that even when people are remotely, they're feeling the benefit of living out the values and the purpose of the organization. And you've got to constantly reiterate and do that to really kind of drill home those values. But it is possible to do it. When people are remote, they have to motivate themselves. So you've got to give them something to motivate themselves to do. And that is all about that purpose and those values, and constantly rewarding people that step into those values and demonstrate them regularly.
Absolutely. James from the Only Networking he's sort of playing devil's advocate like me. He said, why is culture important if you're a startup business with 1 or 2 staff? Isn't culture just for big businesses?
That's a great question. And I know James is being a bit cheeky because I've done the work with him and Kelly on Only Networking. So he is being a little cheeky there. But yeah, this ultimately, when you're an entrepreneur, you can have your fingers in every pie and you can control the culture to some degree. But in order, as your company gets big, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, it becomes harder and harder to do that. You have to work harder to do that. So the sooner you come along and put it in, the better. The sooner you kind of nail down what it is you stand for and what it is you're doing and the purpose you exist, the easier it is to grow. You can hire the right people. You can actually spend time working on your business, not in your business, because the people you hire want to do the job. And the sooner you do that, the better. But there's also the case that even guys working on their own, even sole traders and solo entrepreneurs, actually, if you are really clear on what you stand for and what you're doing, it makes it much easier to cycle through problems. It makes it much easier to focus your messaging for your ideal client avatar. It makes it much easier to find the business you want to work with. And instead of constantly remaking those decisions every time you get a lead, you make them based on your purpose. And then you kind of manage them and they play out on a daily basis. So even for a single person, it makes life much, much easier when trying to market and drive your business forward.
Yeah, and a good point on the sort of solopreneurs and sole traders is that a culture, ultimately, if you're working with freelancers and other people that service certain parts of your business, they need to buy into that as well.
Yeah. I've got suppliers as well. You know, actually,
yes,
there will be clients and suppliers that you do not want to work with because they don't share your values, and you need to understand that as a solo entrepreneur, because otherwise, it's going to be horribly painful 2 months down the line.
Indeed. Ben, we've got we're almost out of time, so I'd like you to just sort of share a couple of sort of tips and tricks that if people are here thinking, well, what can I do with this information? What can I go away back to my business, back to my teams? What can they do? A couple of tidbits or nuggets so they can take away and start to implement or ask the right questions to identify what their culture is, where they stand at the moment.
Yeah, one of the simple questions is, why do you exist? What does your business exist for? You know, what good are you putting out there in the world because you exist? Why did you start it in the first place? Now, sometimes that might be a personal reason, and that's okay. But understanding truly why it exists is going to help massively. And once you've done that, actually, what you need to do is constantly remind yourself of those ground rules, the values you've got. So everything you do, measure it against the values. Once you've defined, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, measure it against those values. Every decision you make, does it fit with our values? If not, we shouldn't be doing it. And the other thing is, I would highly recommend every organization with 2 or more employees, you should get yourself what we call a playbook. And that's where you take those values and you say, look, if these truly are our values, how do they play out on a daily basis? What does it mean for how we interact with each other, how we interact with clients? What can you expect from us as an organization, as an employee? What do we expect from you in terms of how you come to work and what you deliver? And it's the difference between having a kind of an employee handbook that's this thick and sits in a drawer and nobody ever reads, and something that takes the spirit of what's in that handbook and connects with people's hearts. So they actually want to come to work and do their best work. And so I'd highly recommend, and I'll throw a couple of links in the chat of example playbooks on the website so that people can actually see those and actually look to kind of produce their own. But I would highly recommend a playbook because it essentially makes everybody the guardian of the culture and not just the leadership.
Fantastic. Ben, I know this is very much tip of the iceberg, and you've got lots of resources online that people can check out. So do pop that in the chat. But Ben, thanks for joining us. It's always good to hear about different elements of the business world and how people can consider things slightly differently and reframe how they look at things like culture today. So Ben, I'm going to take you off the screen, but really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us today, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you.